Good evening. Welcome to another exciting program of the International Grapevine. This is your host, Wallingford Lee. Tonight on the International Grapevine, we want to put the spotlight on the new mayor of New York City, Mr. Eric Adams. As most of you might know by now, as of January 1st of this year, Eric Adams took over the mayorship of New York City with all the challenges that are expected that he's going to have down the road and going forward. And also how he's going to be judged, long term, short term, and how is he going to be looked at via the media. And most of you who know New York City know well that Eric Adams was a policeman for over 22 years. As a matter of fact, he was also captain of the police department for a period of time also. So he comes very well recommended. Obviously, we're extremely excited to have a new mayor. As both of you who are New Yorkers who know, we had a previous mayor 45 years ago, the great David Dinkins. But I guess he's going to be judged with some of the things that Dinkins had in the past. But that's not important right now. Let's get to talk about just exactly who is Eric Adams, what does he bring to the table, and what are some of the major challenges that he's going to have going forward. What better person to talk about it but a real true New Yorker, a person that has been on the international grapevine more than 4 or 5 times, a very educated friend of mine. I'm talking about Mr. Hank Williams, who happened to be the professor of the Department of English and African Studies. And it gives us great pleasure to always have him on our show. Mr. Williams, welcome aboard, my brother.
Thank you, my brother. Really appreciate the opportunity to be on with you again. Good seeing you.
Well, same here. It's always a pleasure to have you. As you know, as we mentioned just a few minutes ago, the joy, the entire New York community to have a new mayor. And we want to talk a little bit. What does this mean? What the new election of Eric Adams mean for the city? And let's talk a little bit otherwise than what it means for the city. Who did he run against, and how deep the competition was, and what can we expect?
Excellent questions. The question I think is first question. It's too early to answer, but on in terms of what it means for New York City, but on a very basic, simple policy level, you're going to see, and in some cases, we're already seeing a definite shift in terms of key city policies and how you approach things such as education, policing, um, to a lesser extent, transit, which is kind of a wonky area and it's sort of a particularity of how New York City is set up. But those are generally the key things that kind of animate New York City voters, in addition to the basic things that animate voters anywhere, which I think people have to understand is much different when you're talking about very local elections as opposed to state and national type elections. You can literally be undone in. You can literally be undone as a local official by things like trash not getting picked up, right? Or traffic being a problem, or something like that. These very very small local issues. And I think that's one of the things that makes being mayor of New York a really difficult job, partially because you have very tangible issues that touch people locally. And I don't really want to gloss over that because I think that's very important to understand. And I'll also say up front, it's part of the reason why historically being New York City mayor has generally been a political graveyard for people. You don't see people ascending further, generally to higher elected office from here. And I think there are a variety of reasons for that I won't go into now. But I think part of it has to do with what I was just talking about in terms of the local problems, and also the fact that you have to deal with a whole lot of very difficult structural type issues that with our political system and term limits. I mean, the good side of term limits limits is you always have fresh people coming in and different perspectives. I think the difficult side of term limits, and for people who don't understand, there's a limit of two consecutive terms in office of 4 years that a New York City mayor can serve. So I think the difficult thing is that when you're, say, trying to deal with something like the educational system, right? You have 1 million New York City students, or some of the other issues we have. That a lot of the things that really need to be done are require really long-term structural type commitments. A lot of them require a good bit of funding, but more often than that, it requires buy-in from a lot of different people, and that's just very difficult to achieve in a relatively short period of time. But I think, backing up to your second question, in terms of the election itself, you can say this about just about everybody, but I think Adams is very much a reflection of when he ran and the time period that we're in. And near your New York City viewers and listeners will probably remember the campaign. And Adams's key thing was essentially crime, and what was seen as a drastic increase in crime, which is a little bit difficult to get into, because you have to get into a whole lot of things. Number one, obviously, is the pandemic. Number two is that crime actually has ticked up, but some of that kind of depends on exactly which crimes you're looking at, and exactly where specifically in the city uh, you're drawing your stats from. And that's one thing that I think is very difficult for people to get a hand on, because it looks very different if, say, you're looking at Midtown Manhattan, or one of the more affluent or gentrified areas in, say, Brooklyn or Queens, or that kind of thing, or you're looking at it from where my home is, in Bedford Park in the Bronx, and where I also teach at Lehman College. And for instance, one of the very high profile incidents that happened, well, two of them. One was where a small baby ended up being hit and killed by a stray bullet, while mother was sitting inside a car. And that happened 2 blocks from where I live and it's actually kind of scary, because it's a little grocery slash bodega that I pass by and go to all the time. There have been other incidents around that before. And the other one, which I'm sure most people have heard of, is a horrific fire that happened in the Bronx. That's a little bit further away from me, but it's still kind of a long walking distance. But that sort of gives you a little bit of a sense, I think, of what some of the people were responding to, which is that your kind of perception of crime is different. And if you just hear about it on the news, but it slightly less directly affects you, then that's one thing. But a lot of the time, in the neighborhoods where we're actually hit with this stuff, there's sort of a very difficult balance going on, because, number one, there actually is an issue of crime, and I think we should expand that when you're talking about something like the fire, to the idea of there are all these kind of structural things built in, where people are victimized by these systems that are really supposed to protect us and really supposed to help us, and often aren't doing so for a variety of reasons. That's one thing. And the other thing is the very issue of actually getting city services, which is, I think, what a lot of people responded to when Adams was running, because you people want crime to be under control. At the same time, there's and always have been very much issues in terms of how policing has been done in a lot of communities in New York. And your older listeners will kind of remember the old sitcom Good Times. And one of the running jokes of the show, it was fictionally set in the projects in Chicago. But one of the running jokes of the show was, every time something really got serious, um, the mother, Florida Evans, would tell the son Michael, call 911 and tell them we're white. And of course, those of us who are black watching the show kind of got it immediately, because we know, number one, the hope is that maybe they'll actually respond. But we also know that they would very much read where the call is coming from and realize there were no white people there, so it wouldn't matter anyway. But that's kind of that was a fictional thing. But in real time, you really have this disparity where basically, if unless you call in saying shots fired or something like that, or there's sort of an active major crime in progress, you really don't get a response. And that's kind of a real thing that's going on, that people are feeling. And Adams ran against a lot of a very crowded field of Democratic candidates. But the interesting thing is that he ran on a platform really not a whole lot different in a lot of ways from what Bill Thompson ran on when he was opposing Michael Bloomberg a few elections ago, and just barely lost. And Thompson essentially said that he thought the stop and frisk policy just needed to be managed better, which was in really marginally distinguishable from what Bloomberg was saying. And of course, Bill de Blasio comes in and essentially overturns that, promising to eliminate stop and frisk, which to a certain extent he does. And you get the whole Black Lives Matter pushback after that. And the uprisings all around the city and all around the country. So it's kind of in that context that that you get someone like Adams, who is ex NYPD, but also has all these other community connections, saying that he's going to do what seems like the impossible, which is, number one, actually deal with the issues of the inequities of how police treat people, and at the same time deal with the crime problem. Whether or
But
not
make
he
no
can do
mistake
that
about it,
is kind of another story.
right? But make no mistake about it. You cover a great deal of important parts. New York City is a
Mhm.
very, very tough place to work, tough place to manage, and stuff like that. Most mayors survive only one term, and they get really worked up. I think Bloomberg had about two terms, and then he went into an extra third term. Also, Koch
Mhm.
did that for a while. I know
Yes.
for a fact that Eric Adams is coming in a very difficult position in terms of the crime situation and some of the things that you talk about. But I want to go back to one thing and then come back to some of the issues that you talk about.
Mhm.
What type of challenges did he had with Sliwa when Sliwa was running against him? I want to talk a little bit about that. And I want to talk about the fact that he was a captain of police and he was in the police department for a long time. Did that help him to get the votes necessary where the city of New York were looking for people or a person that had the personality, the strength, and the knowledge of knowing the city and how to manage it? How important was those factors for Eric Adams to become the next mayor of New York? And I know there are going to be great expectations for him and challenges with certain things that de Blasio left in the background that could not complete. So let's see if we can talk about a few of those issues.
Good questions. I'm actually going to spend much more time on your second question than your first one, if that's okay. But we can go
No
back
problem.
to that if you want. If you want to expand it some.
Sure.
The election against Sliwa, who Sliwa was running as a Republican. Adams was running on the Democratic ticket that is in the general election. We of course have very hotly contested primaries too. That was most of the polls and most people watching it didn't expect the election to be very competitive, and it turned out that it wasn't. I don't remember the exact poll numbers, but Sliwa basically only won one borough, which was kind of predictable, and that was Staten Island. And Adams won everywhere else, although even that is a little bit more complex, because you have small pockets just about everywhere that can go either way. But Sliwa, for people who don't know, or people don't have a very long memory, He's primarily known, at least in recent years, as a kind of provocative, conservative, slightly right leaning uh, talk show host on the radio, and he also had a show on the New York One News channel that got removed from the air after Sliwa made some really kind of off color
Comments.
sexual remarks about Melissa Mark Viverito, who was our city council president, president at the time. But Sliwa was is primarily known as the founder of the group, or at least one of the founders of the group, the Guardian Angels, which is kind of this
Angels.
vigilante subway patrol that started basically doing civilian patrols of the New York City subways when crime was a lot higher than it was now.
To Eric Adams. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you felt, if it was a big competition or was no competition, and where does it lie from there?
It ended up being not much competition against Sliwa. The most competition was in the primaries, where there were a lot of Democratic candidates, some of whom were fairly strong, some of whom were undone by internal problems in their campaign. Some of them had external type problems, but in the general election, it really ended up the way a lot of pollsters and a lot of people who kind of follow the politics expected it to, in terms of Adams will winning overwhelmingly citywide. And part of that simply just represents the political, the way the way people are registered in New York City. Vast majority of them are Democratic, but politically there's a kind of much wider spectrum than that. I'm sure a lot of people understand. The other piece about Sliwa is Sliwa was very much an outside candidate in a lot of ways. He hasn't been elect. He hasn't won elected office, and he's known primarily as a TV and radio personality. But his background really comes from his long involvement in the vigilante civilian patrol type group, Guardian Angels, that was kind of known for running civilian patrols on the subways when when the crime rate was much higher than it is even now, with the fairly recent uptake. And they apparently actually still do their crime patrols, and very once in a while I see them, but they're nowhere near the profile that they used to have, which is kind of the short version of Curtis Sliwa. But a lot of it really came down to, number one, Adams being very well politically connected in New York. He also ran a very smart campaign. He was state senator before this, a position he gave up to successfully run for and serve as Brooklyn Borough president, and he used that as a springboard to run for mayor, which I'll say, to me, and I'm sure to a few other people who watch politics very closely, it was very obvious that his end goal was becoming mayor when he stepped down, because state senator is a position where there are no term limits, and you have a fairly good opportunity to actually create legislation and public policy, if you want to, and if the political conditions are right. Whereas borough president it's essentially equivalent to the county legislator, or county executive position in a lot of other places. The boroughs are administratively counties, but the way New York City works is that because they're all part of one city, then your primary go-to is the city government itself. So, long story short, is he essentially ran for a position that is term limited and has very little power. So, but it put him much closer to New York City, and I think that's what he was looking at.
And make no mistake about it. That was Eugene, a good plan that he had, and he came up, ran for mayor, and he came in with flying colors. We'll be right back on International Grapevine as we continue talking about the spotlight on Eric Adams, the new mayor of New York City, We talked a little bit about his background in the police department and also where he worked in Brooklyn also. So we'll be right back on International Grapevine. As we move into the month of February, each and every one of you know that it's Black History Month. Obviously, it's a month, it's the shortest month in the year, but it's the month where we talk about achievement and all of the things that have happened to people of color over a period of time in terms of the abuse and slavery that a lot of our grandparents and past black people passed. And we talk also about the great achievements of people like Obama, people like Sidney Poitier, who was a great actor and also helped in the civil rights movement. He joined with Martin Luther King and he brought a lot of people on board. And we also must keep in mind the great and fantastic work that Martin Luther King done for the civil rights movement and also to get us more opportunities in life. So as we celebrate these things about Black history, we need to go back in history, especially the youngsters, to read who we are and where we came from. And we're back here in International Grapevine talking about keeping a spotlight on our new mayor, Eric Adams, who came very well qualified and won the election, basically without much competition. But as you can tell by the information that our special guest has shared with us, Mr. Adams come with a complete, strong background as a former policeman and a guy that have worked in the city and know the ways around. So we want to talk a little bit time allotted. Where do we go from here? Do you feel that being an ex-policeman play a good part in him becoming a mayor? Because I would imagine that that would give a flavor where the city will feel comfortable because of all the rising crime that has happened in the last couple of weeks and time. That he's going to be a guy that's going to put a stamp on. Matter of fact, I think the president of the United States, Mr. Biden, is flying into New York sometime next week to have a meeting with Eric Adams to talk about gun control and to talk about the prospect of cutting down on crime. But let's be fair. We're in January. Today is the 26th, 27th of January, and Eric Adams just took over the 1st of January. So tell me, Mr. Williams, what's your perspective on something like that in terms of what do you think this meeting with the president would be like and where we go from there?
I think being a former police officer is part of it. I think it helped insulate him a little bit politically during the campaign, and really helped him play to a certain extent both sides of the fence, right? In terms of countering some of the more progressive leaning candidates who were really pushing on much more aggressive strategy to actually deal with number one, the outsized amount of influence and also outsized budget that the NYPD has in New York City, and the ongoing issue of overly aggressive policing. That's on the one side, and on the other side, also dealing with the issue of crime, where I think that dovetails with the current proposal is that a lot of what Adams was presenting during the campaign, and somewhat worrisome to me, or at least something that I think was left open to question, is a lot of it seemed to be leveraging his personal position as a former police officer and the type of clout that would bring with the NYPD. Now, the problem with that, as a lot of people know, is that you can't really, that's one relationship where a personal relationship and or personal credibility really isn't enough to cut it, because you're dealing with very powerfully entrenched union, and also a very literally entrenched force, in terms of the city, one that undid Bill de Blasio's mayoralty in a whole lot of ways. And so I thought so one of the things that I always thought was that he really needs to bring some sort of he needs to have some sort of structural strategy to deal with it. And I'm not sure that he can, and I'm not necessarily sure that he can deal with that aspect of it in terms of bringing real reform to the police and how the police operate and the amount of power and influence they have in city government. But the heartening thing for me is with the anti-violence proposal, he does seem to be stepping back from a very simple knee-jerk reaction of simply just throwing more enforcement at the problem, which isn't really going to fix a lot of the things going on, and at least presenting the idea that he's going to take a more holistic look at things,
Okay, when you say holistic, what do you mean by that?
meaning that he's what he's putting forward is trying to take a look at what are the reasons that we have crime, and what are the roots of crime, and those a lot of times connect to issues of poverty, issues of people who don't have jobs, and or the structural type of resources in the community that can get them to be more stable, productive members of the community. And that's sort of part of the reason that you have the rise part of the rise of crews, gangs, that kind of thing, where we know specifically in terms of gun violence a lot of it comes from. And he's also been very vocal about talking about the issue of illegal guns in the city, which for a long time and still is very much the spillover from a lot of places that have very loose gun control laws, and basically have a lot of sellers who, not all of them, but there are a lot of gun sellers who are not very careful in terms of how they who they sell to, and what happens to the guns after they get out of there. And they're essentially funneled into large cities like New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, New Orleans, et cetera, et cetera. So Adams seems to be trying to see if he can begin to get some traction on that at the federal level. And if that happens, that is going to be significant. But needless to say, there are going to be a lot of issues with that, and the tripwire with that has always been Congress.
Do you think he has a brand new competent staff? Because one of the things that kind of hurt De Blasio a little bit is some of the people that was around him. And I guess Mr. Adams come with a great amount of experience because he's been in New York for a long time and the different jobs that he had. So I guess a key component is putting together a great staff. Matter of fact, I think one of his brothers part of the staff that he brought along. What is the conveyor belt in that type of situation? What should be surroundings in terms of putting together the right people? And when we think about the COVID and all those type of things confronting New York City and the entire nation at the matter.
Well, I think staff is one of the key things for him, and frankly, one of the key things I look at for anybody who gets into any kind of significant office. Who do you have around you? And one of the things that kind of shows somebody's strength is if they can assemble a crew of people who are going to be competent, give good advice, and also push back when necessary, and whether or not somebody in the league can actually take that criticism or correction to heart. But oddly enough, one of the things that Adams has been criticized about are some of his choices for staff, such as the most obvious one you notice, which is the appointment of his brother to be head of security. And the new and New York City and state actually have very strong ethics laws about that. And the news broke late this week that that the ethics department would actually allow Adams's brother to serve as a slightly different office than I think he had originally been proposed for. But he's essentially going to be chief of security. However, he can draw a salary of only $1, and there are other stipulations on there, basically because they want to prevent nepotism. And there's been the general critique in that a lot of the people Adams has appointed are people he's been close to for a long time. Now, that in itself, I will say, is, well, A, it's not unusual. And B, that can kind of go both ways. And Adams's argument is, look, I need to have a crew of people who I can trust, meaning I know who they are, and that we can get. And number two, I have certain, as a person who's been elected to be the leader of the city, I also want to have a team around me that's going to reflect what my priorities are, that number one he knows, and number two he can trust to essentially carry out the directives he wants in terms of how he wants to shape New York City. And I think people can see the dual issue there. Number one, on a basic level, you can kind of understand that, but number two, that very much creates the potential for corruption, nepotism, insider dealing, self dealing, all the type of thing. I mean, a lot of the things that we saw with the Trump administration, and we've seen elsewhere. I won't say that's necessarily the case here yet, but it is definitely a concern.
Well, let's talk about two things going in because we're running a little bit out of time. I know one of the things that he has to grapple with, it's very important, is the school system and the impact that it's going to have on children in terms of mask, in terms of education and stuff like that. And also to probably end it, let's talk a little bit. What is his relationship with the media?
So far, Adams's relationship with the media, I'd say, has been fairly neutral. People have been critical. And when I say critical, I mean in a good way, in terms of doing the job that the media is supposed to do, because part of what media is supposed to do is hold people in public office accountable. So you see some of that in terms of their digging into and asking very hard questions about, okay, what is the nature of the appointees that he has. They're also asking questions because he has been slightly slow on filling all the positions he needs to fill, and around some of the other things. So the thing that I think hasn't necessarily happened yet is the sort of antagonistic relationship that a lot of elected officials can run into with New York media outlets. And part of that is the fact that you have to deal with some very strong tabloids here. Most I would say most obviously and notably the New York Post, particularly when you're talking about Democratic office holders. So that hasn't happened yet, and I think that's something to watch.
Very interesting. We have probably about 2 or 3 minutes. Let's talk a little bit about the educational system. I mean, 3 minutes is not enough to do it, but what is his major challenges with the education system in terms of children going to school, the mask situation, the COVID, and stuff like that?
There are there are a lot of them, and you just highlighted the one biggest thing, which is COVID, the shifting COVID situation, and also the question of safety in the schools, which is kind of something that, to step back a little, I'll say that that's something that everybody across the nation is dealing with. And that is one thing that I will say there really should be there should be and needs to be more support on a federal level. And that's kind of where you get one of the problems of politics generally in the US, which is that local slash federal split. But honestly, there are some things like that where the federal government is the one that really has the resources to actually hire scientists and have experts, and should really be, I think, putting down a much more comprehensive, essentially, template, and maybe not mandating every single thing for districts, but I think they're very much should be a template of best practices that everybody should follow, and we should be following that and doing a little bit less of it on our own. But very specifically, very but beyond that, you still have big issues in terms of effectiveness of schools, and you have wide disparities in terms of the outcomes of Black and Latino children. And one thing that Adams is, very much focused on, very much so, oddly enough, Black and Latino boys.
Well, Mr. Williams, we have approximately 3 minutes. I mean, you have answered quite a few issues that face in the city. But one of the things that I want to close out and for the next 2 or 3 minutes, can you tell us what are some of the major connections that Eric Adams have in the city of New York?
Good question. I think obviously most people know about his political connections through being in elected office in both Brooklyn and statewide. He also has a lot of political connections, and he has a lot of municipal connections. One of the strategic things that he did to help him get elected was line up the support of a lot of influential unions early on. The thing that I think a lot of people skip over, and or don't know, are some of the wider connections that he has in his background and in Brooklyn, which I don't necessarily think are a bad thing. But you see, part of it is that if you don't understand this part, and if you don't understand the particularities of Black life in New York, you're going to miss. And one of the key things that's been reported quite a lot is the incident that sparked him to join the NYPD, which was essentially being beat up by police officers after an arrest, and a black cop intervened. Everybody knows that. A lot of people, fewer people know that it was a direction of a local church that actually inspired him to go into the NYPD and essentially said, why don't you go in and try to be a part of the change? What a lot of people don't necessarily know is that, the local pastor you're talking about are the Daughtries at House of the Lord Church in Brooklyn, specifically Reverend Herbert Daughtry and Karen Daughtry, who at that time were co-running the church. I believe they both retired not too long ago. But Daughtry is important because he's a very key political figure in New York, in the country, and in Brooklyn, though he's not a household name. And his connections to the National Black United Front, a lot of campaigns over the years. Sharpton has ties to him, and a lot of people. This is going to ring alarm bells for a lot of people. But to that, I would say it's much more complex and much deeper than that, which kind of shows you what the mix of things are that brings Eric Adams to be who he is, because there is very much a local and deep personal connection with Black people in the city that goes along with that, and is much deeper than what you might see on the surface. So that's where you have the mix of forces shaping how Adams thinks, that seem contradictory on one hand, but also shows you the complexity of Black life and the influence of the experiences that we've had here.
Based on that, we have to hold up right there because we'll run out a little bit out of time. I want to take this opportunity to tell you thank you so much for being our special guest. You brought a lot of things to the table who a lot of people might not have been aware of. Running the city of New York is a very complex situation. I honestly feel that Mr. Adams is very quite qualified to do so. Hard, tough, strong, But I think he's an honest person, and I think his connections are good, especially with the daughters. It go way back. That's a gentleman that I interviewed many years ago on our program, and he's very well connected. I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the family of Grapevine to tell you thank you so much for being a special guest. And we must and should do a part two about Eric Adams in the city of New York.
Thank you very much. I look forward to it.
So do I, my brother. And again, this is Wallingford Lee saying goodnight for International Grapevine and saying to you, we hope to see you next week at the same place at the same time. And thanks for viewing our program. Good night.